Frontline Conversations, leading the debate since 1984.
Hello and welcome to Frontline Conversations with me, Amit Baruah, your host for this episode. The assassination of Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, chief of Russia's Nuclear Forces Command, on the 17th of December, along with an associate in Moscow, just raised the ante in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine's security service has taken source-based responsibility for this attack. An Uzbek man has been arrested for the terror strike. What does this mean for the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, which will be 3 years old in February next year? What does the ascension of Donald Trump to a third term mean for a war that has been crawling along? To answer some of these questions, I have the privilege of Mr. Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary and India's ambassador to Moscow, joining me on this show today. Welcome to Frontline Conversations, Mr. Sibal.
Thank you for inviting me.
Mr. Sibal, to go straight into the meat of the matter, what is your sense, this assassination of Lieutenant General Kirillov, head of Russia's Nuclear Forces Command, also believed to be head of its biological and chemical warfare command. What does this mean in your view?
Well, there is an attempt to continue escalating the conflict on the part of Ukraine, supported by the United States, UK in particular, France also, and NATO in general. They feel that Russia can be pressured. Russia is in a relatively weak position. Russia does not want a confrontation with NATO. And they have seen that they have crossed repeatedly in the past what are supposed to be Russia's red lines. And Russia really has not reacted. So they believe that they can keep doing this progressively without getting actually directly involved with boots on the ground against Russia. Though, mind you, this is a bit of a charade also, because they have what they call mercenaries, but some of them, I believe, are special forces. In fact, they have acknowledged that they have special forces on the ground. So in that sense, they are directly involved. And Putin has made the broad point, which is rational, that there is no way that Ukraine can launch these long-range missiles into Russia without active involvement of NATO forces, in the sense that the operation of the missile, the targeting of the missile is not in the hands of the Ukrainians. So to that extent, NATO is directly involved. But then again, where Putin has publicly acknowledged that, but he's not treated it as a red line. Though, mind you, with the launch of the Oreshnik missile, he demonstrated that if push comes to shove, he has the means below the nuclear threshold to cause damage to the adversary, which would be like, in effect, damage caused by a nuclear weapon without the radiation. So at what stage they'll push him to the point where he feels that he's compelled to use this, because he also has to manage not only public opinion at home, but the political class at home. And there are a lot of Russians who are demanding that stronger action should be taken against the West and against Ukraine. So at what point he would decide to do that remains uncertain. The last point in this regard is that he wants to give Trump a chance. After all, Trump has been saying repeatedly during his election campaign that he wants to wind down the war, even unrealistically saying that within 24 hours, he'll finish it. And Putin has said in his press conferences more than once that he's willing to listen to Trump. And the latest statement that he's made, which has been interpreted as full of meaning, because for the first time he used the word compromise, that he's not closed the door to negotiations, he's willing to compromise, which means that he's waiting for Trump to place cards and see if there is any prospect of actually finding a solution to the war. Though if you ask me, I think Putin is being, as usual, extremely diplomatic, mature. He's got a lot of experience behind him. He's not like these fellows in the West who come and go and who have a particular agenda which is unrelated to serious geopolitics. They're not looking at the future. They're looking at their domestic support and how they can survive and whatever else. So Putin has always, I can't say what his internal thinking is, one doesn't know, but in terms of his public posture, he comes across always as very reasonable, moderate, willing to negotiate, but he has said in the past that he's willing to negotiate, but the starting point of negotiations would be what was agreed at Istanbul. And that the realities on the ground have to be taken into account. Now, I can't see him changing that position at all.
Mr. Sibal, I'm just going to ask you to hold that thought just for a second and ask you, do you believe that this latest assassination, there have been others as well, do you believe that Western intelligence could also be involved in providing at least information to the Ukrainians?
A matter of speculation, given by the record of the West, this can't be entirely ruled out, but then there is no hard evidence to this effect. They have, point is that within the erstwhile Soviet space, there is free movement. With Central Asia, for instance, and therefore Uzbeks and Tajiks and others, they work in very large numbers in Russia. And Russia is a huge Muslim population, not only in the Caucasus, but also in Tatarstan, where the last Kazan summit was held. So they can easily merge with the local population. And the Ukrainians in the past, when the Kerch bridge was attacked, had again used people from, I forget what the source was, but it was a very indirect way in which they did it. So they could easily have recruited this Uzbek and paid him at whatever they're saying, $100,000, whatever the amount is, to kill him with an electrical scooter. I would like to think that that it is more the Ukrainians who have done it rather than being advised on by the West as to who to target, etc., etc.
Mr. Sibal, to get back to the issue of the war, I mean, what's happening with the strikes inside Moscow and all do probably reflect an intelligence failure as far as the Russians are concerned. And that's something which Mr. Putin has himself acknowledged. The question that I want to ask you is that with the Trump presidency, you made a reference to it in your earlier remarks. And his unrealistic promise to end the war in 24 hours. What is your sense now? Where do the Russians and the Ukrainians go from here?
Well, before I answer that question, there's one additional thought with regard to the assassination of General Kirillov. That this is a terrorist act. Now, I'm surprised that the British, for example, the British Prime Minister has, in fact, indirectly endorsed this. When he was asked a pointed question about whether this was a terrorist act, he said, we stand fully with Ukraine, which actually meant that Ukraine was right in doing so. And the editorial in the Times has said that this was in self-defense, which means that tomorrow, if Putin decides to eliminate Zelensky or anybody else, the same argument can be used by Russia, but they will never allow Russia to use that argument. There'll be an international furor, not only in the West, but I think in some of the other countries, even in the global South, they will deplore such an act. So I think before I go on to the question that you asked, I think the West, which talks about its values and I mean, it is becoming almost unbearable, this kind of hypocrisy and double standards and double speak. I mean, they are not even conscious of the fact that the rest of the world also has its own mind and they assess things on their own. And simply to say assassinate a Russian general is in line with Western values, and therefore the rest of the world will accept it, is utter nonsense. I just don't know what's happened to the quality of Western leadership, but then point is, I have an opinion, but that is neither here nor there. But with regard to Trump, Trump is sending mixed messages. The person is nominated as his special representative for Ukraine, a special former general. In the past, if you look at his statements, he's been very, very harsh and very strong and very negative, fully in supportive of Ukraine and advocating that Ukraine strikes deep into Russia. Subsequently, he has modified his statements, but you know what his thinking is. I mean, if he has modified his statement, his past declarations or statements, it is more to be in tune with what Trump wants to convey in terms of his interest in resolving this. So this doesn't mean that fundamentally this gentleman's thinking has changed. And then there is psychological warfare in this. You see, when if Trump were to appoint a peacenik, a person who's been advocating a solution, who's been deploring what is happening on the ground, and really wants to wind down the conflict, saying that a lot of price is being paid by everybody, including the United States. Let's say a person like Robert Kennedy Jr. Were he then to be appointed, then the Russians automatically have a psychological advantage, because before them, they have a person who actually wants peace and he wants a solution. But if before them they have a person who's hardline and who can both present himself as somebody willing to talk about peace, but also step up the ante and put more military and other kinds of pressure, then the Russians have a problem on their hands, and they are the psychological. They will be under psychological pressure, knowing that this man is a hawk. Then how to continue the dialogue with him by yielding something here and there, so that his hawkish positions are somewhat diluted. That is one aspect.
One other thing, I mean, Trump has been full of surprises. I mean, we know his position on, the Russia-Ukraine war. But do you think that he could pull out some surprises from, his vast repertoire of statements and what he does?
I don't know. I just read that yesterday or day before. The Financial Times quoted sources within the Trump administration. I don't know if it was directly attributed to Trump, that he'll continue to give arms to Ukraine. Now, this could also be a kind of a pitch in advance of negotiations, a warning to Russia and Putin that if you don't respond the way I want you to respond, because I have the upper hand, I can move both ways. So I'll continue to give arms to Ukraine and make life difficult for you. See, the thing is that the United States, in effect, whatever Trump may say about US paying a price for this military adventurism and all that, the fact is that in this conflict, the least price that has been paid by any country is the United States of America. On the contrary, they have gained the most. They have pushed
They've spent $108 billion, Mr. Sibal, so far. That's a lot of money even for the US.
Look at the LNG. They are forcing the Europeans to buy LNG from the United States at much higher costs. And in fact, the van der Leyen or somebody else in the EU has said that we have to deal with Trump, and therefore, in order to placate Trump, we must buy even more LNG from the United States. Trump was always against the Nord Stream pipeline. He was the one who imposed sanctions on Russia. He's the one who started first supplying arms to Ukraine. So his record is a bit mixed. And coming back to, you see, there's no direct security threat to the United States of America. The direct security threat, if at all, is in the European theater, because the consequences of the war would be felt most by The Europeans, and already you've seen how Germany has suffered immensely because of loss of energy, cheap energy from Russia, and the loss of the Russian market. I mean, the automobile industry, which is the mainstay of their economy, has already suffered. And on top of that, I was talking to some Russian a few weeks ago, and he said, as you know, in the past, he's a friend of mine, that Russia, Moscow was full of BMWs and Mercedes and this and that. No more. It's all Chinese cars. And he says that some of them are even better than the German cars. So they've lost this huge market. And the manner in which German discourse is with regard to this war, one cannot see a reconciliation between Germany and Russia for the foreseeable future. So coming back, they've handed over the foreign policy of Europe to a small Baltic state of a few million people, which sort of fits into one of the colonies of New Delhi. And she is the geopolitical head of, I'm talking of Kaya Kallas, of the European Union, who has been on record to say that the Russia should be broken up, just as the Soviet Union was broken up. So if you have these kind of policymakers who are defining European policies toward Russia, it's Europe that's going to suffer the most. You have recession in many European countries. You have political problems in many European countries. Look at France. It is becoming ungovernable. Germany, in any case, has become going to have fresh elections. Britain is in a terrible mess. So anyway, to come back, I think United States feels that it has a better hand, an upper hand in all this. And Trump would like to, his general view that let me focus on making America strong again, concentrate on internal rejuvenation of the economy, and look at the interests of the middle class and stuff like that, and not get involved in all kinds of wars. That is part of his discourse. On the other hand, Amit, when he says that I want to make America great again, but great again for what? I mean, great again in isolation, or great again in terms of being the preeminent power? And if you want to make America great again and the preeminent power, and want to use the levers in your control, including tariffs, to bully everybody else, what does it mean? It means assertion of American power.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, what is your sense we see post Cold War, there was broad coexistence between Russia and Europe and the United States. There was some cooperation, as you rightly point to, the energy linkages. So what is the reason? I mean, Putin had always pointed to the creep of NATO. He had always pointed to these dangers. Why is it that the Western powers, and this I include the United States, why is it that they can't exist with Russia? I mean, what is the issue that why can't you open negotiations, open dialogue on the issues of concern, and which they keep advising India and Pakistan, for instance, to do? These are nuclear powers. They keep telling India and Pakistan, you must behave responsibility, you must have dialogue. The kind of nuclear threats that are being hurled today by the United States and Russia, I mean, they're absolutely shocking. So what is your sense? I mean, why is this larger question? Why can't you coexist?
Well, there's a history to all this, which countries like us or people like us can't really relate to. Because Russia, under the Tsars, has played a huge role in European history. In fact, there have been coalitions and this and that in which Russia has been involved. Russia, in fact, occupied France also in 1870. Their forces occupied France. And then, all the wars that have been fought from Napoleonic times right up to Hitler. And Russia looms very, very large in the eyes of Europe, the biggest country in the world, huge natural resources, and a tremendous staying power. And even in terms of population size, even though for a large country like Russia, it is relatively very small, but compared to European powers, it's a very large population, 140 to 145 million. And then a formidable nuclear power, a formidable military power. So how do you manage this country? Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which actually occurred because of the breakup of the Soviet system, and not really as a result of any great success of the West, as they claim. Anyway, that was the moment when they could have taken advantage, when Russia was on its knees, wanted actually even to join NATO and become part of a larger European security architecture, etc., etc. But I think, rightly, from the geopolitical point of view, the West, from their point of view, I'm not talking about my point of view, that here we have the Soviet Union that has been broken up. Russia is in total disarray. So let's look at the future and make sure that Russia is permanently weakened. And here's an opportunity for us to surround Russia with our power, which we couldn't do earlier because of the Cold War and Russia's nuclear capabilities and everything else. So they started expanding NATO, and Russia had no choice. So they kept accepting the expansion of NATO till Georgia and Ukraine were offered potential membership. And Putin had been saying repeatedly, which is acknowledged by the CIA chief when he was ambassador to Russia during my time. In fact, I had conversations with him too, that he advised the State Department, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. It's not simply Kremlin or Putin or anybody else, it's the Russian elite, the Russian nation, the Russian people who do not want this, who will oppose this. And Putin has said clearly, I'll use all my means at my disposal to prevent this from happening. Anyway, they did it. And that has eventually, and you know what happened in Ukraine. Coming back a little bit, the entire strategy has been defined by the great chessboard of Zbigniew Brzezinski, where he said that if you remove Ukraine from Russia, Russia no longer is a European power, it becomes an Asian power. This is the game. This is the game. This is what is defining the European elites. Now, Germany thought that, and not wrongly from my point of view, and very sensibly so, that let us anchor Russia in the European security architecture through economic means. Russia has got the huge resources of natural gas, so let's make use of them. We don't have those resources, so it's a win-win situation. So you had the pipelines and this and that and that, but who was most against it? The British. And some others who said that, no, this is creating, first of all, they were very envious that Germany was getting cheap energy which gave them a tremendous economic advantage because of cost of production going down. And the British started pressing, while they were a member of the European Union, that there should be a common energy security policy, which means there should be no price differentials in energy supplies. Therefore, the cost of Russian gas which Germany gets should not be lower than what the other countries have access to in terms of gas and this and that. Anyway, so Germany thought that this was a good way to anchor Russia in Europe, creating this interdependence. And then they went in for Nord Stream 2. Once that happened, if you recall, the opposition, the two countries most opposed to this was Sweden. Finland, of course, but Sweden was most opposed. And generally speaking, Denmark and others, they were most opposed to this because it was going through the Baltic Sea. Anyway, this is, to my mind, it is a folly on the part of the West. And now look at the arguments they're using. Even Macron, I'm a bit disappointed that I thought that the French were capable of having an independent view of things and look at things more rationally than the Baltic states or Poland and others who have a very checkered history with the Soviet Union or Russia or the Tsars. But he also says that if Russia wins in Ukraine, Europe is in danger. Russia's imperial ambitions have been revived, and we must secure our future generations from the Russian threat. For heaven's sake, Russia can't even cope with Ukraine. Leave aside trying to trigger a war with NATO. It is not in a position to do that. And Putin has himself given facts and figures that look at my GDP and look at the combined GDP of Europe and look at the economic resources at their command, etc., etc. He said, why should I strike at NATO? What for? His ambitions, one may dispute that from the European point of view. I am not an advocate, spokesman of Russia. But from his point of view, his ambitions have been very limited, very precise, that he doesn't want NATO at his doorstep. It is an existential threat for him.
And Mr. Sibal, what do you feel? How is the war going? What is your assessment of the military situation in Ukraine?
Well, there are two explanations. One is that Russia has not been able to effectively prepare itself for this war, and there was some serious miscalculation about its ability to achieve results very quickly, possibly an overthrow of what they call the Bandera regime, etc., etc. And he did not deploy enough military assets if the idea was really to win the war on the ground quickly. With 200,000 people, Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe after Russia. It's a huge, huge, huge territory. And in the Battle of Kursk against the German Wehrmacht, there were a few million, I forget exactly the figure, 2, 3, 4 million soldiers on each side. So with 200,000, you think you can win the military conflict with Ukraine? That was not his intention. His intention was that Crimea is mine, and he waited for almost 7, 8 years by giving every chance to the West, to the Ukraine, and to its backers that Ukraine's sovereignty minus Crimea can be preserved. The Donetsk and others, they can remain part of Ukraine. And that was the sense of the Minsk Agreements 1 and 2, which was, mind you, which was ratified by the UN Security Council. And that would have actually preserved the larger territorial integrity of Ukraine. But this was not accepted. And now Hollande and Merkel say that they wanted to gain time to build the Ukraine. And then they started training Ukraine armed forces, this and that and that and that, to prepare Ukraine to continue the conflict with Russia. So that is one aspect. The other is that I think, to my mind, Russia's aims have been limited, as I just outlined. Even during the Tsarist times and Stalin's time, the Soviet Union, Western Ukraine was a huge problem for Russia and for the Soviet Union. There were always these elements were engaged in subversion and in terrorism and everything else, and Putin has himself acknowledged that Western Ukraine was never part of Tsarist Russia. Stalin incorporated it during the second, prepare for the Second World War, if you like. But they are Catholics. They are very closely linked to the Polish-Lithuanian Empire in the past. But they don't. So they have always been Ukrainian nationalists in this part of Ukraine. So Putin knows that he can't control them, and he doesn't want to overextend himself. So his larger goal is, of course, the Crimea and the Black Sea, because that is the only warm water access to warm water that Russia has, and the Russian Navy, as it is relatively weak, but will become even weaker if the Black Sea fleet can no longer be maintained. And Putin has said that he can't envisage Ukraine being part of NATO because Sevastopol will become a NATO base. And that's the end of not only of the Russian Navy, but the entire southern flank of Russia will be terribly, terribly exposed. So his aims are limited: control over the Black Sea, make sure that his naval fleet which has been very greatly damaged already, that it can be preserved. And very importantly, and this is something which we don't focus on, and mind you, we should focus on, look at what's happening in Bangladesh. We are concerned about the Hindu minority and everything else. But there is a Russian minority, and a huge Russian minority in eastern Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, in the Donetsk region, and all these regions. They are Russian speaking, and they have been discriminated against. And for how many? 15 years, they have been and especially from 2015, they have been subject to bombardments and this and that by the Ukrainian armed forces. So why should Russia not be concerned about the fate and the future of its own Russian origin, Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine, in the face of the brutalities that they have suffered over years by the what they call the Nazis in power in Ukraine.
And what is your opinion, Mr. Sibal? Do you think that there will be negotiations of any serious nature to come to some kind of arrangement between Russia and Ukraine?
Serious negotiation, yes. Some kind of an arrangement, very, very difficult. It's a very tricky situation for Russia, mind you. It's not tricky for the United States. Realistically speaking, the United States has the upper hand because they are secure. There's no threat to them. And Russia is not going to place missiles and everything else in Cuba or in Nicaragua, whatever have you. Yes, but I'll come to that a little later. But Russia is really fighting with this one arm behind his back, or whatever the phrase is. and it has suffered losses. Yes, its economy has not collapsed, but that is not the same thing as saying that its economy is flourishing. Yes, they've been able to tide this over. Sanctions haven't worked, but there are huge problems on the ground, even with India. We can't make payments to them. Then how do we continue to trade with them and reach all the figures that we have in mind when the mechanism for payments are not there? Now they have sanctioned even Indian companies, 19 of them. And now Europe threatens also to sanction Indian companies. So they are disrupting everything, including global supplies of fertilizers and food and energy and all that. So the world is also suffering. So Russia, relatively speaking, is on the back foot. It doesn't have as many cards to play as the United States has. A couple of things here. What Russia is counting on is the European fatigue, a European collapse of will, a European economic, if not collapse, massive economic problems, which will then actually begin to affect the unity of NATO, which is why the NATO discourse has become very uncompromising and very harsh, because that's the only way they can sustain, NATO can survive. If NATO begins to talk about peace, then NATO is finished. And this is what they have publicly acknowledged. Even Kaja Kallas and Mark Rutte, that we can't talk of peace. That's not the purpose of NATO. The purpose of NATO is not to bring about peace. So that is one. The other for the United States, which is the problem, and for Trump, is Russia-China. After all, these two powers, formidable. If Russia is not a formidable economic power, it's a formidable resource power, and China has become a formidable power in so many domains, including manufacturing and military. Combined, it's the problem for the United States. And the United States cannot, and Trump cannot, and Europe cannot continue with a situation where Russia and China actually become closer and closer and begin effectively to build an alternative system of payments and everything else, which has long-term implications for the US hegemony, that of its dollar and everything else. And with the international system fragmented the way it is, frankly, the West is isolated. The US and Europe, the transatlantic arrangement, which has dominated the world for many decades. But now power has dispersed, And indications of that they are available with the kind of countries who want to become member of BRICS because they want to hedge their bets. They see that power is shifting. They don't want to live under American Western tutelage. They don't like the idea of NATO having global responsibilities. So this is something which Trump and America would have to worry about, and maybe therefore Trump also feels that if somehow he can find some solution to the Ukraine conflict, then this will actually begin some kind of a distancing of some sorts between Russia and China, because at the end of the day, Russian elite is very Europe-oriented, very Europe-oriented.
Mr. Sibal, thank you so much, for providing us this, spectrum analysis of what's going on in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and the intentions of the United States. And, like you, we will closely watch what Trump does and whether or not there will be any serious negotiations. But as you said, it's a tricky matter and it's a difficult nut to crack in a sense. So we'll keep watching this, and we would be glad to have your insights again on Frontline Conversations. Thank you so much for talking to us, Mr. Sibal.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Frontline Conversations, leading the debate since 1984.